My name is Verena Holst. And at 71, I've learned that silence often hurts more than cruelty spoken out loud. I live alone in a small bungalow near the Charleston harbor, a house my late husband Henry once called our last good project. He was a machinist with steady hands. I was a bookkeeper who liked things to balance. Between us, we built a life out of thrift and patience. That afternoon, I was polishing the old brass porch lamp Henry restored years ago. Its glow had dulled over time, but when I rubbed the cloth across it, the light still answered. I found comfort in that rhythm-white breathe shine until the phone on the porch table buzzed. "Mom," my daughter's voice came through smooth and deliberate. Marit had her father's tone, but none of his gentleness. "We need to talk about Thanksgiving." I smiled automatically. "Do you want me to bring the cranberry relish again?" A pause stretched on the line. Then she said, "Not this year. We're having important guests and the space is limited. I can sit anywhere," I said lightly, thinking she was only being practical. Her voice softened, too careful now. "Mom, this place isn't for useless old people." "You understand, right?" The cloth in my hand stopped moving. I could hear gulls crying somewhere above the harbor, the faint sound of traffic down Leona Street. I told myself she didn't mean it, that the words had slipped out of fatigue or thoughtlessness, but her silence stayed, waiting for me to make it easier. "I understand," I said quietly. I don't remember hanging up, only the way the lamp flickered once, as if reacting for me. My hands trembled, and I steadied them against the railing until they obeyed. The sun was lowering over the water, casting long shadows across the porch steps. Inside, the table still held a stack of recipe cards and a folded grocery list: sweet potatoes, brown sugar, 1 bottle of cooking wine. I set them aside and stood at the window until dusk turned the glass to a mirror. My reflection looked older than I remembered, but not useless. The lamp outside kept burning steady and small as the harbor light faded. Thanksgiving morning arrived quiet as breath. The harbor fog hung low over the rooftops, softening everything it touched. I woke early out of habit, still half expecting the old rhythm basting chopping, setting the table. Instead, the kitchen met me with stillness. I filled the kettle, then stopped halfway through. No one would be coming. The scent of polish from last night still lingered on my hands. I washed them again, though the smell wasn't what I wanted to erase. I decided to make something: small vegetable soup, a piece of bread tea with a touch of honey. Cooking felt like keeping my pulse steady. When the broth began to simmer, I found myself humming the tune Merritt used to dance to when she was 8, the one from her first recital. She had twirled around this very kitchen sequins, falling from her costume like sparks. Henry had clapped until his hands were red. Now only the clock ticked. I carried my bowl to the table and sat where Henry once sat, the chair that still tilted slightly to the left. I tried to eat, but my appetite had folded into something smaller than hunger. The soup cooled while I watched the sunlight creep across the counter. On the counter lay the scarf I had knitted for Marit, soft alpaca wool, dyed a pale green. I touched the fringe, then folded it neatly and set it back inside its box. There would be another time, or maybe there wouldn't. After washing the single dish, I mixed a bit more flour and sugar and made a small loaf of bread. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and clean. When it was done, I wrapped it in a towel and placed it on the porch railing. "For anyone who might need it," I murmured. Then I sat by the window, hands folded, watching the harbor light spread through the mist. Somewhere beyond that, quiet, people were carving turkeys, clinking glasses, saying grace. Inside my house, the lamp burned steady, a single flame keeping company with me. By mid-afternoon, the fog had lifted, leaving a weak sunlight that seemed to hover without purpose. I had just poured myself a second cup of tea when a knock came at the door, soft but certain. When I opened it, Mrs. Calloway stood there, wrapped in a wool shawl the color of smoke, her gray hair tucked beneath a scarf. She was 80, though her voice still carried the crisp tone of a teacher who expected full attention. In her hands was a foil-covered dish. "I baked 2 pies by mistake," she said, smiling in a way that dared me to contradict her. "You shouldn't spend the day alone, Verena." "I was just sitting down," I said, stepping aside. "Come in before the chill takes your joints." She laughed. "Too late for that." "Coffee always," I replied. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same one Henry built from oak boards decades ago. She poured while I sliced the pie. The crust flaked perfectly, and the pumpkin filling carried the faint scent of nutmeg. "I still can't believe it's Thanksgiving," she said. "The years blur together once the noise fades." "They do," I answered quietly. She looked up from her cup. "Marit not coming this year." I hesitated. "No. She's hosting some guests." Said it might be awkward. Mrs. Calloway's eyes softened, but didn't pry. "People confuse respect with reputation. One can feed you, the other will starve you." I smiled, but my throat tightened. "You sound like my husband." "He was a good man," she said. "He fixed my old washing machine, once refused a dime." After we finished, she mentioned a flickering lamp in her hallway. I followed her across the yard and tightened the socket until it glowed steady again. On the walk home, I passed the turn toward Marit Street. Cars lined both sides, shiny and unfamiliar, their license plates from other states. Laughter spilled from behind her closed windows, high, practiced, untroubled. I stood there only a moment before turning back. The evening air smelled of cinnamon and exhaust. My own lamp waited ahead, burning low but faithful, guiding me home. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I stopped by the post office to mail a small thank you note to Mrs. Calloway. Inside the line was long and restless. I was almost to the counter when I heard someone call my name. "Verena." I thought that was you. It was Nadine Price, a woman from Merritt's church circle, always polite, always ready to share what didn't belong to her. She clutched her handbag like it contained state secrets. "I didn't see you at Marit's dinner," she said brightly. "It was quite the affair." I nodded. "So I heard." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Such a shame you weren't well enough to come. Marit said your memory had been giving you trouble. You poor thing, forgetting things at your age must be frightening." For a second, I couldn't breathe. The air thickened between us. "My memory is fine, Nadine." Her eyes widened, unsure which part of her story had betrayed her. Oh, I must have misunderstood. I smiled thinly. "You did." When I stepped outside, the December wind cut straight through my coat. I walked home without remembering the turns I took. Inside, I sat at the table until my hands stopped shaking. The words replayed in my head, not well enough to come. Memory giving trouble. So that was how Marit had excused me. Not old, not embarrassing, demented. Easier to say her mother's mind was fading than to admit she'd erased her by choice. I opened the drawer where I kept my records, the same place I stored every receipt and tax notice Henry and I ever filed. Beneath the envelopes was the cedar chest, its brass hinges dulled but unbroken. I lifted the lid and found the folder marked in my handwriting, "House still in my name." Inside lay the original deed for the Lakeview property, notarized 16 years earlier, Henry's signature. Mine beneath it. The bank had added Marit and her husband only as occupants, never owners. The taxes, the maintenance, the insurance, all traced back to me. The anger settled into something steadier, a slow pulse of clarity. I closed the folder carefully, pressing the brass latch until it clicked. For the first time since that call, my hands were still. By Monday morning, the decision had already settled inside me, quiet as a closing drawer. I cleared the kitchen table, laid out the folder, and began to read. Each page told its own story, the deed, the tax receipts, the letters from the bank manager Henry used to joke with. At the bottom of every document, our names appeared in blue ink, his firm and angled, mine neat and exact. 16 years had passed since we bought that property by the lake, yet the paper hadn't forgotten a thing. By mid-afternoon, I drove downtown to the Charleston County Clerk's office. The building smelled faintly of dust and toner. At the counter, a young clerk with kind eyes glanced at the papers, then back at me. "You still listed as primary owner, Mrs. Holst," he said. "Everything looks solid. These signatures, your husband's right." I nodded. He had a way of making a line look proud. The clerk smiled softly. "They don't sign like this anymore." He stamped the page, initialed the corner, and slid over a small stack of forms. "If you'd like, you can file a restriction notice prevents transfer or collateral use without your consent. Protects your interest." "How much?" $32. I opened my wallet and counted out the bills, crisp from the bank. "Worth every cent," I said. He processed it, gave me the receipt, and handed the folder back with a quiet respect I didn't need him to name. When I returned home, the harbor light had turned gold against the windows. I sat at my desk and wrote the letter slowly, each word deliberate. Marit, you may host whoever you like, but not in a house built on my trust. Mom. I folded the note and slipped it into an envelope, along with a certified copy of the notice. The clerk at the post office stamped it, sealed it, and handed me the receipt. Walking out, I felt the December air sharp against my face, the kind of cold that wakes you from a long sleep. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders straightened without effort. The papers had remembered what my daughter had chosen to forget. She arrived just before noon, the sound of her car braking too sharply against the curb. I was in the kitchen rinsing a cup when the knock came, 3 hard strikes that rattled the frame. When I opened the door, Marit stood there, cheeks flushed, coat half buttoned, a white envelope crushed in her hand. "You had no right," she said, stepping past me without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door quietly. "Good morning to you, too." She turned, eyes burning. "You humiliated us in front of investors," Evans said. "They pulled their proposal after hearing about the property notice. Do you know what that cost us?" I wiped my hands on a dish towel. "I only reminded you who owns the foundation you're standing on." Her breath caught. "You think this makes you strong? You embarrassed me." "No," I said evenly. "You did that yourself when you told people your mother was losing her mind." She blinked. "That was exaggerated. I just didn't want them to see you as..." Her voice thinned. "Ordinary." I let the word sit between us. "Then you should have made them see you as extraordinary." The heat in her face faltered. "You don't understand what it's like trying to be taken seriously. Everything is about image now. Presentation, clients, reputation. One wrong impression and you lose people who never mattered," I finished. "You built an image, Marit, not a home." She stared at me, anger trembling into grief. "I worked so hard to make something better for all of us. You were supposed to be proud." "I was," I said softly, "until you decided I was a liability." Her shoulders dropped, but her pride kept her upright. "You could have called before filing that notice. You blindsided me." "I learned from you," I replied. "You blindsided me first." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, a gull cried somewhere over the harbor, sharp and distant. Marit pressed her lips together, fighting tears she didn't want to show. "I can't fix this right now," she whispered. "I didn't ask you to," I said. "I just asked for truth." She turned toward the door, hand tight on the knob. "I'll call when I can." "I'll be here," I said, though neither of us knew what here meant anymore. When the door closed, the house fell quiet, except for the faint hum of the old brass lamp. Its light stayed steady, unflinching long after her car disappeared down the street. 3 weeks later, I drove past the lake house for the first time since that day. The sky was gray, the kind of color that makes sound carry farther than it should. A moving van sat in the driveway, its back doors open, like a mouth mid-sentence. 2 men were loading boxes, while Marit's husband stood beside them directing without looking at me. When he finally did, He gave a small nod, more habit than courtesy. I parked at the curb and stepped out. Merritt emerged from the doorway. Her hair was tied up carelessly, and her face looked older than it had any right to. She hesitated when she saw me. I came to collect a few things I said. She moved aside without argument. Inside the house felt half-hollow footsteps echoing against bare walls. I walked through the living room Henry and I had once painted for her. The scent of packing tape and dust filled the air. In the corner of the den stood a small box labeled Miss. I opened it, my husband's old toolbox, the lamp we'd given them for their first anniversary, and a photo album I thought had been lost. Marriott stood nearby, arms crossed. "I was going to drop those off," she murmured. "I know I said, but it's better this way," she nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. The men called from outside asking about the next load. She turned away to answer, and I slipped the photo album under my arm. On the last page, a note fluttered loose. The handwriting was uneven, a child's scrawl. "Mom is the smartest person I know." I traced the pencil line where it had faded, then folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my coat pocket. When I stepped outside, the van doors slammed shut. Margaret stood by the porch, trying to smile, but not managing it. I raised a hand in quiet farewell. She didn't wave back, but she didn't look away either. By the time I reached my car, the wind had picked up, scattering a few dry leaves across the empty driveway. By spring, the ache had softened into something manageable, like an old bruise you forget about until you touch it. I filled my days at the Charleston Maritime Museum, volunteering twice a week to organize their ledgers. Numbers were steady company. They behaved when treated with care. One afternoon, a trainee named Lila stopped by my desk, holding a stack of receipts she couldn't make sense of. She was 22, maybe younger, with nervous eyes that darted between the papers and my face. "I keep making mistakes," she confessed. "The totals never match." I looked over her columns, penciled lightly in uneven lines. "You're rushing," I said. "Numbers don't respond to panic." She laughed, embarrassed. I need the hours. I'm behind on rent again." "Then slow down," I told her. "Rushing is how people lose more than money." She frowned, unsure if I was talking about bookkeeping or life. I handed her a clean sheet. "Start over. I'll help you balance it." As we worked, I told her how I'd once managed 3 separate accounts for a shipping company, all by hand before computers made it easy. She listened carefully, her pencil tapping softly against the page. When we finished, the numbers aligned perfectly. "You did that," I said. She smiled. "No, you did. Respect doesn't retire with age, Lila, and neither does skill." She blinked, nodding slowly. "Thank you." When I returned home that evening, the air smelled faintly of salt and rain. The tulips I had planted last year were blooming pale yellow against the soil. I stood for a while on the porch, watching them move in the breeze. The brass lamp beside me burned steady now. No flicker, no dimming. I had replaced the bulb and cleaned the wiring weeks earlier. It gave off a calm, constant glow, one that reached just far enough to meet the sidewalk. I didn't know if Merritt ever passed this way anymore, but if she did, she'd see it small, steady, and still shining. It was a Thursday evening when I heard the knock soft, almost unsure. I was folding laundry in the living room, the brass lamp already lit against the fading light. When I opened the door, Margaret stood there holding a small bouquet of tulips. Her eyes were red around the edges. Her hair unbrushed, her hands trembling slightly. "No investors, Mom," she said quietly. "Just me." I stepped aside. "Come in before the light fades." She hesitated, then crossed the threshold. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us carried too much history to rush. "I didn't know what flowers you liked anymore," she said, setting the bouquet on the table. "So I guessed." "They're perfect," I said. "Sit down." I poured tea while she looked around the room. Her gaze stopped on the lamp Henry had built, the same one I'd rewired last winter. You fixed it, she murmured. I fix what's worth keeping, I said, placing her cup in front of her. She smiled faintly, then looked down. I've been thinking about what I said. And what I did. I thought respect came from looking perfect. I was wrong. You weren't wrong to want respect, I said. You were wrong to think it comes from performance. Her shoulders dropped the way a child's might after being scolded, but forgiven. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know I said. But you did. She nodded, eyes wet. I'm not asking you to forget it, just to let me try again. I stirred my tea slowly. Trying is a start. But next time, don't try to look better. Try to be better. She let out a shaky breath. Half laugh, half sob. That's fair. The kettle clicked as it cooled. Outside, the dusk deepened until the only light left was the one from my lamp, warm and steady, on both our faces. For the first time in a long while, we sat without armor. Two women who finally recognized the cost of pretending. A few weeks later, I rewired the porch lamp again. The copper had darkened from years of salt air, but the filament inside still caught light, like memory refusing to fade. When I finished tightening the last screw, I attached a small brass tag beneath the base. It read, "Built by boundaries, kept by respect." I stood back and let the glow settle over the porch, gentle but certain. Most days I still walked to the Maritime Museum and worked through their ledgers. Lila now managed the accounts herself, neat and confident. Sometimes after closing, we would sit by the harbor with 2 paper cups of coffee and talk about ordinary things, recipes, the weather, the right way to measure patience. Every so often, a letter from Mairead arrived. Sometimes it came with a jar of homemade jam, sometimes a pie wrapped in foil. The notes were short, cautious, but real. "Thinking of you," one said. Another, "I saw tulips today." I didn't always reply right away, but I kept each one in a drawer by the phone. One afternoon, she stopped by unannounced, left a pie on the porch, and didn't knock. I found it later still warm, the smell of cinnamon faint in the air. I carried it inside, set it on the table, and smiled. Some things didn't need words to be understood. As the sun dropped behind the Charleston rooftops, the porch lamp flickered on, catching the brass tag in its light. For years, I had waited for a place at someone else's table, mistaking invitation for worth. Turns out, all I needed was a light that stayed on. I may eat alone sometimes, but I live unashamed, and that is its own kind of feast.